The notary's office smelled like old paper and cold coffee when Nadja Berger finally saw it with her own eyes, a signature that was supposed to be hers, sitting at the bottom of a page she had never signed. Her hands trembled as she stared at it. Somewhere in Freiburg, a tax investigator was asking questions nobody in her family could answer. And somewhere inside that quiet office, the truth about her father's death, her cousin's desperation, and a secret debt that had poisoned an entire family was waiting to surface. But to understand how a missing signature could unravel 3 generations of lies, you have to go back to the beginning, to a woman who believed, for far too long, that her family simply didn't love her enough. Nadja Berger was 31 years old, a quiet, practical woman who had spent most of her adult life trying not to need anyone. She worked as a project coordinator for a logistics firm in Freiburg, the kind of steady job that paid the bills but never made her feel proud. She had sharp brown eyes, dark hair she kept pulled back out of habit rather than style, and a way of holding her shoulders that suggested she was always bracing for disappointment. She had reason to. Her family ran Berger & Sohn, a furniture company built by her grandfather's hands and expanded by her father, Werner, and his younger brother, Rolf. For 3 generations, the Berger name had meant honest craftsmanship, solid oak tables, handcrafted chairs, the kind of furniture people bought once and kept for a lifetime. Nadja had grown up in the smell of sawdust and varnish, sitting on her father's workbench while he explained the grain of the wood like it was a language only he could translate for her. But Werner was a quiet man, the kind who avoided conflict at almost any cost. And in a family with 2 brothers, quiet men often get overshadowed by louder ones. Rolf was different. Charismatic, decisive, always the one who negotiated the big contracts and shook hands with the important clients. Rolf's children, Malte and Sophie, grew up believing the company was rightfully more theirs than anyone else's. Malte, 34, was sharp and calculating, the kind of man who always had a plan 3 steps ahead but rarely looked back to see who he'd stepped over to get there. Sophie, 29, was warmer on the surface, generous with hugs and compliments, but Nadja had learned over the years that Sophie's kindness often came with a price tag nobody mentioned until later. Nadja loved her family. She wanted, more than almost anything, to belong to it fully. But there had always been a quiet hierarchy nobody spoke about directly. Rolf's children came first, and Werner's daughter came second. It wasn't cruelty. It was simply the way things had always been, the normal pattern of a family that mistook convenience for fairness. 2 years before this story truly begins, Nadja went through a difficult divorce. It was the kind of year that strips a person down to nothing: long nights of paperwork, custody discussions, property division, and endless visits from lawyers who spoke in language designed to confuse rather than comfort. During that time, Frau Lechner, Rolf's longtime assistant at the company, began visiting Nadja's apartment to help her manage the stress of it all. Frau Lechner was in her 50s, soft-spoken, endlessly patient, the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday and always brought good pastries. She sat at Nadja's kitchen table for hours, flipping through documents, pointing to lines, saying gently, "Sign here, don't worry about this one, it's just a formality." Nadja trusted her completely. She trusted her family completely. That trust would later become the crack the entire fraud slipped through. Werner died on a Tuesday morning in March, his heart giving out suddenly while he sat reading the newspaper at his kitchen table. Nadja was the one who found him, the one who called the ambulance, the one who sat beside his hospital bed holding his cooling hand while Rolf, Malte, and Sophie were all somewhere else: Munich, Portugal, anywhere but there. 2 weeks later, at the will reading, Nadja learned exactly what her devotion was worth. The lawyer, her Fassbinder, read through the document in a small office that smelled faintly of dust and old coffee. Werner's 40% ownership of Berger & Sohn was to be split among the family. Except there was a clause. A single devastating paragraph explaining that Nadja had voluntarily waived her inheritance rights 2 years earlier in exchange for a one-time payment she had, according to the document, already received. Nadja stood up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I never signed that," she said, her voice shaking. "I never received any payment. Rolf wouldn't meet her eyes. Sophie stared at her hands. Malty cleared his throat and said quietly, "Nadja, it was a stressful time. Maybe you just don't remember. Forget signing away her inheritance? For money she never saw?" Her Fassbinder looked uncomfortable, but explained that the signature had been notarized properly, dated, stamped, legally binding. There was nothing more to discuss. But something in his expression told Nadja he didn't fully believe that either. She walked out of that office that day with her hands shaking, not from grief anymore, but from something colder settling into her chest. Months passed. Sophie posted a photo online of a brand new car, captioned "New Beginnings." Malty liked it. Rolf commented with 3 heart emojis. Nadja stared at that photo longer than she should have. New beginnings, right after her father's death, right after her name disappeared from the ownership papers. Something didn't add up. And Nadja Berger, for the first time in years, decided to stop being the quiet one. She pulled public company filings through the Handels Register and found something strange. A holding company registered in Liechtenstein, created years earlier, its ownership listed only as family trust beneficiaries. Furniture companies rarely needed accounts like that. She called an old university friend, Jonas, now a tax attorney in Stuttgart. He reviewed everything she sent him and called back within a day, his voice tighter than she remembered. "Nadja," he said, "this isn't sloppy bookkeeping. Someone moved assets before your father died, likely to avoid inheritance tax and possibly to erase other heirs from the ownership structure entirely." "Other heirs," Nadja repeated. "Meaning me." "Meaning you." Nadja drove to the notary who had supposedly witnessed her waiver signature, a small practice she had never visited, in a town far from where she'd lived during her divorce. The notary, her Wechsler, hesitant at first, eventually pulled the file and frowned. "This is strange," he murmured. "This signature was confirmed by phone, not video, due to a scheduling issue. I don't usually allow that unless there's no other option." He turned the file toward her. A margin note read, "Assistant present, R. Berger's office, identity confirmed by phone." Someone in Rolf's office had confirmed Nadja's identity for a signature she never gave. Then Nadja remembered something else. Her divorce lawyer's office had also handled the original paperwork independently. If a waiver document truly existed from that period, there should be 2 copies. One with her divorce attorney, one with the family lawyer. She requested both. Her divorce attorney's copy contained no waiver page at all. The version sitting in the family lawyer's file was the only one that had ever included it. The fraud hadn't happened during her divorce. It had happened afterward, inserted quietly into one specific file, in one specific office, an office where Frau Lechner worked and where access was supposed to be limited. Nadja requested the office's digital access logs through her attorney, Frau Dr. Herman, a sharp inheritance law specialist who listened to the entire story without interrupting once. "This isn't a family disagreement anymore," Herman said. "This is fraud. And if we can pinpoint exactly who accessed that system on the day the document was created, we can prove it wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate." The access logs arrived 3 weeks later. Nadja sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Frau Lechner had once helped her sign paperwork, and read through the timestamps with her heart pounding. The forged page had been created and printed using Frau Lechner's login credentials. But Frau Lechner had been on approved vacation in Italy that entire week. Nadja stared at the screen, her stomach twisting. Someone else had used Lechner's login to create the forgery, someone who had access to Rolf's office, but wasn't Rolf's assistant at all. When Nadja gently confronted Frau Lechner weeks later, expecting denial, she instead saw something unexpected. Fear. Real fear. "I didn't do it," Lechner whispered. "I told them I would take the blame if it ever came out, because I was scared of losing my job, scared of what would happen if I said the real name out loud." "Whose name?" Nadja asked. Lechner's hands shook. "Sophie's." The security badge system at the office, still active for guest logins normally reserved for visiting clients, confirmed it. Sophie had entered Rolf's office alone that day, using a guest credential, at the exact hour the forged waiver had been printed. Nadja sat in her car outside the office for a long time after learning this, staring at the building where she used to visit her father as a child. The villain in this story had never been her cold, distant uncle. It had been the cousin who once braided her hair at family gatherings, who had hugged her at the funeral and whispered, "We'll get through this together." But why would Sophie do something this serious? Nadja needed to understand before she could decide what to do next. The answer came from an unlikely place, a shaking, tearful phone call from Sophie herself, made not out of confession, but panic. "You don't understand," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "I was being blackmailed." 2 years earlier, Sophie had entered a private investment deal that collapsed, leaving her with debts she couldn't explain to her father without shattering his image of her. The man on the other side of that failed deal threatened to expose the details publicly, to clients, to family, to anyone who would listen, unless she paid him back quickly. Desperate and terrified, Sophie had used her access to the family lawyer's files to create a document that would quietly move company funds meant for Nadja's inheritance into her own control, framing it as an old, forgotten waiver. Nadja felt her anger tangle painfully with something else: pity. Sophie had planned a calculated betrayal from the start. She had been cornered and desperate, and Nadja understood cornered desperation more than she wanted to admit. But the story wasn't finished unraveling. Jonas, still digging through financial records, discovered something that changed everything again. The man blackmailing Sophie wasn't a stranger. He was a former business associate of Maltese, someone Malti had personally introduced to Sophie years earlier, and someone Malti had known was threatening her for months, without ever warning anyone. Nadja confronted Malti directly, her voice steady despite the anger boiling beneath it. "You knew," she said. "You knew Sophie was being blackmailed, and you said nothing. You let me believe I imagined signing that waiver. You let me think I was losing my mind." Malti's calm mask finally cracked. "I didn't want to get involved. I told myself it wasn't my problem. It became everyone's problem," Nadja said, "the moment you stayed silent. But there was one more layer buried beneath all of it, the deepest one." Jonas found records showing the same blackmailer had approached Werner directly, months before his death. Werner had known about Sophie's crisis. He had been quietly negotiating a private settlement to protect his niece, carrying the stress of it alone, telling no one, not even Nadja. The private Liechtenstein holding company Nadja had discovered earlier hadn't only been built to shield assets from Rolf's earlier financial mistakes, it had also become Werner's last, secret attempt to absorb Sophie's crisis quietly, to protect a family that had never fully protected him back. Nadja sat with that revelation for days, grieving a version of her father she hadn't known existed, a man who carried other people's storms silently until his heart simply couldn't hold any more weight. When Nadja finally confronted Sophie one last time, the conversation was different from anything that had come before it, quieter, heavier, stripped of performance. "I was always going to give it back," Sophie said, tears sliding down her face. "Once the blackmail was resolved. But then the tax office started asking questions and I panicked. I hid it instead of fixing it, because I was terrified everything would come out at once." Nadja studied her cousin's face for a long moment. Is that the truth? Or is that just what sounds best right now? Sophie didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, Nadja understood that the truth and a convenient story could sometimes look exactly the same, and that she alone would have to decide which one to believe, and what justice should look like now. She chose the law over her own uncertainty. Frau Dr. Hermann filed formal claims, fraudulent notarization, falsified corporate documents, unlawful transfer of assets. The tax office, informed early and transparently by Nadja herself, treated her as a cooperating witness rather than a suspect, exactly as Hermann had once predicted. At the final sentencing hearing, something happened that no one in the family expected. The judge revealed a private codicil Werner had quietly filed in his final months, a clause stating that if any heir committed fraud against another, that heir's inheritance share would automatically transfer to the person wronged. Werner hadn't written it as punishment. He had written it as a warning shot, hoping the mere existence of consequences might stop Sophie before she ever acted. It hadn't stopped her in time, but it guaranteed, now, that Nadja's full inheritance was restored completely and permanently. Sophie was given one legal path back into the family's trust, full public accountability, and financial restitution. She accepted it without protest, her voice small but sincere for the first time in the entire ordeal. Rolf faced serious penalties for failing to secure his own office systems and for his role in enabling the environment where the fraud occurred, though the investigation confirmed he had never personally orchestrated it. Frau Lechner, having lied to protect Sophie out of fear, received leniency after her honest testimony helped complete the picture. Malte's silence earned him no legal punishment, but it cost him something else: Nadja's trust, permanently. A year later, Nadja stood inside the Berger and Sohn workshop in Freiburg, the smell of fresh oak filling the air the way it had when she was a child sitting on her father's workbench. She was a part owner now, not out of revenge, but because it was still her father's legacy to protect. She understood something now that she hadn't before. Paper could be forged. Signatures could be stolen. But truth, patiently uncovered, always finds its way back to the surface. Her father hadn't just left her company. He had left her proof that love sometimes hides in silence, and that justice, however delayed, is never truly lost, only waiting for someone brave enough to go looking for it.